We're here in Bernard Rands' study and workroom, and it's a wonderful room full of scores, books, recordings, pictures, and you can hear the distant rumble of Chicago outside. Welcome, Bernard. It's wonderful to talk to you.
Thank you. Thank you, William.
1934 was an extraordinary year. Elgar, Holst, Delius died, and their spirits came to Bernard Rands, Sandy Gurr, Harrison Birtwistle, and some others.
Peter Maxwell Davies, yeah.
Tell us about your childhood.
I was born in Woodhouse, a suburb, shall we say, of Sheffield, although it was more or less incorporated into what was then a pretty iron and steel of a town, mucky, foggy, and into a family of very poor, working class people. I had 9 uncles on the 2 sides of my family, all of whom were coal miners. And my father was a janitor, a caretaker of the local school, children's school. My mother was his assistant. I began piano lessons when I was 4, and that may seem strange in the context I've just explained, but both my parents were innately musical, with no professional training whatsoever. But I realized subsequently that my father had perfect pitch, because if somebody started singing, wherever they chose, even if it was in the cracks, he could immediately go to the piano and just play in exactly the same keys on. And my mother sang. She had a very deep contralto voice, completely untrained, but and as a boy it was almost embarrassing. It sounded more like a male than a female. But anyway, they during the war years they performed together a little bit at the local events and so on and so forth. But because of their musicality in that sense, there was a piano in the house. No television, no radio, just a piano. And they put me with the local piano teacher, an oldish man in his middle to late 60s, and we did the usual things. By the time I was 10, it was decided that I'd made enough progress that I really needed another teacher to sort of push me to another level. And quite by chance, one of the school inspectors who used to come periodically to the various schools to make sure that the attendance slips were all done and the teachers were doing what they were supposed to be doing, was actually a terrific pianist who played quite professionally in the Sheffield, Yorkshire area. And he would sit at the piano in the school and play with my dad. So my father approached him and said, "Do you take any pupils?" And he said, "Well, yes, I do a bit of private teaching." So it was arranged that I would do that. Now this is the crux of the story. I went for my first lesson. Oh, and he told my father prior to that, when Bernard comes for his first lesson, I want you to buy him a manuscript book, an empty manuscript book, and he had to bring it to every lesson. So I showed up with it, and we did our lesson and so on. And then, thereafter, every week, he would sit down and he would write in this manuscript book a melody. Maybe it was the upper part of a Bach chorale, or just a hymn tune, a popular song of the day. And my task was to harmonize it during the week. No theory, just these. Discovering and finding what sounded right to me. Or sometimes he'd give me 7 or 8 chords. Say, "Bernard, make these into, you can make them into figurations, and you can write get a little poem or a text or something, but make a piece out of them." Can you imagine many piano teachers on this planet who would teach a 10-year-old boy that way? And I became so fascinated. Sometimes I neglect my practicing because I really wanted to make these pieces good for him. I wanted him to But the main thing, William, is that this was the arbiter. No, nothing else, no other guidelines, other than the music that I was learning to play. And I've kept that as the case in the subsequent almost 80 years. This is what determines what I put on paper. And if I can't hear it properly and don't care for what I'm hearing, I don't see why anybody else should have to suffer through it.
So outside the home and the lessons, what was musical life like?
Well, the other thing about mucky Sheffield at that time was that it shared the Halley after 1946, 47, when Barbirolli reconstituted the orchestra. So every week, I mean, I was at every concert. My dad would give me his last half-crown to get a ticket. But I also had a very good music teacher in my grammar school who also arranged for me to go to things. And when, at that time, they'd also do some rehearsals in Sheffield. So I would go with whatever they were playing. I'd get the score out of the library and sit there. And on one occasion, after I'd been going for quite a while, Barbirolli, you remember him with his gruff voice, he said, "And who is this young man checking on me all the time?" So, because I adored him, I mean, I just worshipped him. But that orchestra, as you well know, he brought it to a level which matched most great European orchestras, with a lot of women. Maisie Ringham and Joyce Aldous, and he married the first oboe player, and so on. Because a lot of the men never came back, I mean, from that earlier orchestra. So that was, for me, an inspiration. Secondly, for whatever, well, there is a reason. Sheffield was blessed with good libraries and a very good museum and a very good university. So if you could see your way through the fog to get wherever you wanted to go, there were ample things to engage your mind. I say the reason for that was that my father used to read to me almost every night of my childhood. Now, he must have been dog-tired by the time he got home from work, which was often late. But he would always read to me, and not just children's stories. He would read poetry, which was above my head at that time, but just the assonance, the sound of his voice, and the way he... You know, and even when I read literature at the university and I would come home during the vacations, he would say, "Well, what have you been reading?" I would say, "Well, we just did a thing on Spencer or on this or that." Damn it, he's read most of it, because he used to go to what was then the WEA, the Workers' Education Association, and get books out of the local library. He was that kind of self-taught person who, had he been born at another time, William, God knows what he would have been capable of. But, you know, born in 1897, spent his 17th birthday in the trenches in Belgium. Yeah. So that's basically the thing that helps me keep both left feet on the floor. I mean, that's the way it is. I'm not easily, you know, wooed by a lot of stuff that goes on in our profession.
And outside of music, what were your other interests besides literature?
Oh, football. Football. Not many people know this, but I was quite heavily recruited from grammar school, and I played with Sheffield United junior team for a couple of years before I went to university. Then I played for the university. I didn't have a professional ambition about it, but I loved it. I enjoyed it. But once I got to university and involved in many other things, music took over. And, you know.
I know one of your other passions is tennis as well.
Yeah, later in life I started to play quite a bit of tennis, yeah. I didn't start early enough to be good at it in the real sense. But Gusty and I and our friends, when we had our home in the Berkshires, we played tennis 2 or 3 times a week. And, yeah.
So after leaving school, you went to the University of Wales.
I did,
to study an interesting mixture of music, literature, and Celtic.
Yes, yeah, yeah. Well, it was an interesting, serendipitous choice in a way, because I'd been admitted at Birmingham and at Manchester and Durham. But then I went for an interview in Bangor, small college that it was at that time. But the then Professor Parry Williams, head of the department, and the other lecturer impressed me so much that I thought, I feel comfortable here. I stayed several days and mixed in with some of the students who were, particularly at the weekend on Saturday morning, and they would all gather together at 10 o'clock and sing their heads off for, an hour and a half. And, that seemed to me a perfectly natural and cozy situation. But I loved my time there, and I made myself learn the language. I learned Welsh. And subsequently, when I went back to teach on the faculty, I did half my teaching in the Welsh language. So I was always known as the Yorkshire lad who speaks Welsh. It's a kind of strange mixture.
And coming from your background, how was that university education paid for?
Oh, well, first of all, 1944, the Butler Education Act. I was just passing my 11 plus exam at that time, and then that Education Act followed by the Attlee government elected in 1945 at the end of the war, that any child who passes the examinations shall go to university free and shall get a cheque every month as a stipend. And there aren't any fees to be paid, that's it. And, can you imagine? And we're still trying to struggle to get back to that in some ways that maybe it's a lost cause in this day and age, but it made it possible for me. I mean, my parents, one end of a university from another. So that's basically what all that was about. During the time that I was in Bangor, I was writing, and whenever I'd finished a piece, I would just lasso a group of players and say, I'm going to teach you to play my music. And
so there was no musical program in performing program?
It wasn't a music college in that sense, no. It was part of a total, like, because I did two degrees, one in literature and philosophy and the other in music simultaneously. But there were a lot of students who played and sang. Harpists were, all over the place. And it happens to be my favorite instrument. And I'd get together small half a dozen choral vocal groups, just teach myself. The model for this, of course, is Boulez, who had early on no intention of becoming what he became as a maestro. But nobody would play his music in Paris, so he got the 12 or 14 best players at the Conservatoire, and Domaine Musical became the beginning of everything.
So the music course at the University of Wales, what did that consist of, the composition course?
And this is another very, very important thing. By the time I graduated, by the time I finished a master's degree, I had written something like 250 fugues and the same number of motets in the style of Palestrina, or Bird, or Lassus, and Know the Difference, or Purcell, and so on. So every week we had to do this, I think what I've done ever since stems from that. I mean, this counterpoint is a simple matter in one sense. It's either that. If it's that, it often is not very interesting. But one going one way, one going the other. So the Tudor Church period that music just touched me very deeply. Even as a young man, I did that. Is, you know, the bird five-part mass. I mean, damn, where did that come from? You know, and so I've always had a love for that. Subsequently, one of my aunts took me to York, ostensibly to go, well, to look at the historical nature of the city, and to visit the railroad museum. It so happened there was a part of the 1610 Monteverdi Vespers being performed in the Minster, and I sat there. I didn't know Monteverdi from a hole in the ground. I mean, I just sat there with my aunt, and so she knew that. And to this day, I can have that sensation. Where did this come from? And at that point, the windows, which had been put in coal mines during the war, had still not been replaced. So it was a very strange, bizarre experience, almost like a person with the holes in their head, you know, this just blocked up. Anyway, and I became, for the rest of my life, a lover of Monteverdi's music. Because of the connection he had to his predecessors and the experimental nature of his courage, you know, to take this into the. So, yeah.
Well, you write so expressively and so beautifully for the human voice. But did you sing as a boy?
Yeah, but only you know, in the family, and but it's a tradition in England. Even as a teacher, I've often said and often forced my students, there are two things, or three things, excuse me, if you're a composer, first of all, you should be able to stand up and conduct your own music. No professional aims to be this or that, the other, but learn how to direct and get from what you want. Two, be able to sing, and I'll come back to this in a minute. And three, you should be able to dance without being club-footed. Because if your body doesn't move, you've no sense of rhythm. When we started school, I went to my dad's school. In fact, as a baby almost, I'd been running up and down the corridors with him, working. Then, of course, I had to start school at 4 and sit at the table and do as I was told and so on. But every morning, we would do solfege. Do, so, fa, mi, do, so, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, re, mi, do, so, ti, do. So I've always been able to solfege things, you know, and it's the easiest way. We do that, and then we do 20 minutes of times tables. 2 times 2 or 4, 3 times 4 or 8. That's all gone. Huh? But when you think about that in a relatively primitive society, I mean, poor, it was an extraordinary thing. I wasn't aware of it in these terms then, but I've become aware over the years that, God, that was inculcated into me from childhood.
Poor materially, but rich in so many other ways.